Pierre Poilievre is back in Ottawa after a rather challenging 5 months. We'll take a closer look at whether the Conservative leader has once again found his footing. Plus, a new book looks at how Canada's public broadcaster has lost its way and how it can turn things around. That's next on episode 32 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Hey folks, thanks for joining us here on the Rob Breakenridge Show podcast. So great to have you along with us. A lot to get to on this episode of the podcast. Later on, a conversation with writer and broadcaster David Cayley. He spent many years at the CBC and has written a new book about Canada's public broadcaster. It is called The CBC, How Canada's Public Broadcaster Lost Its Voice and How to Get It Back. That's coming up later. But let's start the show with the latest out of Ottawa, where after a very trying 5 months, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is back in Ottawa, back in the House of Commons, and there to hold this government to account. Obviously, Prime Minister Mark Carney has enjoyed a bit of a honeymoon since the election, but the challenges are mounting up for Canada. So there's high stakes ahead of this session of Parliament and some big decisions that the government has to make. Now, we did learn that a budget is coming on November 4th, a little bit later than the government maybe had originally led us to believe. And in the meantime, there's much for the government to deal with, of course, with the ongoing tariff threat, the trade relationship with the United States, and questions now about the future of our trade deal with the United States, in addition to domestically issues around immigration, law and order, and so on. So there's a lot there, I think, for the Conservatives to focus on, and a real opportunity for Pierre Poilievre to continue this comeback tour of his, if that's what this is. Of course, losing the election, losing his seat, regrouping, running and winning in a by-election here in Alberta, and now back in the House of Commons. So the exchange, one of the exchanges this week, which was interesting, and it shows where I think the Conservatives see the economy as a weakness for this government, as Canadians are increasingly concerned about an economic slowdown, about joblessness, in addition to concern about government spending and what kind of a deficit this government is going to be running here. Here's the exchange from Wednesday in the House of Commons between the Prime Minister and the opposition leader.
How big is the deficit that the Prime Minister is running?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm looking forward with the Minister of Finance to releasing the budget on the 4th of November. That budget will contain the biggest investment in this country, in this country's future in a generation. Building homes, building new port infrastructure, new trade corridors, new energy infrastructure, building the strongest economy in the G7.
Well done.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, surely, if he was such an expert, he would know the size of his own deficit. It's now halfway through the fiscal year. 6 months have gone by, and he has announced $40 billion of additional spending. Deficits drive up inflation, grocery prices, housing costs, and interest rates. They drive out investment from our country and uncertainty that destabilizes our economy. That's why every other Prime Minister in Canadian history has announced the deficit at the beginning of the fiscal year. We're 6 months in. Does he even know the size of his own deficit?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I know many things. And one of the things I know, the member opposite, the Leader of the Opposition, just mentioned interest rates. One thing I know is that Canadian interest rates are much lower than American interest rates. They're lower because this country's fiscal situation is strong, because this government has a plan to grow this economy, and we will keep doing it. We'll keep it.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the collapsing economy is bringing down interest rates, but the financial expert doesn't even know what his own deficit is. But another financial expert spoke yesterday. The parliamentary budget officer said the deficit will absolutely be higher because of additional spending. He said he doesn't know what the government's fiscal anchors are because they do not exist. He says the labor market sucks and wages are not going up. These are quotes. Is this why Liberal members on the committee who heard those truth bombs threatened that the Prime Minister would fire the parliamentary budget officer after 166 days.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
I don't recognize that, Mr. Speaker. I don't recognize that characterization. I just appointed the parliamentary budget officer, and this government does have fiscal anchors. This government has fiscal anchors. We are going to spend less so the country can invest more. We are going to balance the operational budget in 3 years. We are going to have a declining level of debt, and we're going to do all of that because we're building the strongest economy in the G7 for Canadians now.
Well, joining us now for some further perspective on Pierre Poilievre's journey back to Ottawa, some of the challenges and opportunities that are now facing the Conservative leader. Very pleased to welcome to the program Ben Woodfinden. He's a senior advisor with Meredith Boessenkool Philips, also director of MPB Intelligence, more at mbpolicy.com. He's also a former director of communications for Pierre Poilievre. Ben, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Let's talk about Pierre's comeback, if we can quite call it that at this point. But certainly, I mean, it's been a challenging few months for Pierre Poilievre, losing the election, losing his seat, working his way back to Parliament. What do you make, first of all, of just how he's had to navigate all of this?
Yeah, I don't think he's had it easy. It would be the mildest way I put it. I think it's probably I've said it to a few people. I think he's been in kind of purgatory for the last couple of months. We had the result was obviously very disappointing for us. And full disclosure, I worked on the Conservative campaign. So, this time last year, we thought we were going to win. We didn't win. That's disappointing for everyone. But there was positives from the result. We did gain seats. We did gain votes. So, but then the Pierre losing his seat was, it stung, right? It stung him personally. It stung people around him. So he had a summer that was, I think, purgatorial, where he was out of the limelight to a certain extent. He had to go. This time last year, he probably didn't think he was going to be spending this summer traipsing around rural Alberta trying to win a seat. But he won it. He worked very hard in the seat. The result was actually a very impressive result, I think, in that there was a lot of people kind of hoping to kind of make him struggle there, talking like separatist sentiment or the longest ballot thing. But he was pretty decisive. And so I think that kind of gave him some of his groove back a little bit. And he's in the week since he won, they've done a lot of kind of policy announcements. They're trying to reclaim control of the narrative and the agenda, which we did a good job of, I think, if I can pat my own back on that, for a couple of years where we drove the agenda on domestic issues. So he's got lots of challenges up ahead, but I think he's finding his footing again. And I think Carney is going to find that he is a formidable opponent still.
Yeah, I wonder if some ways the by-election campaign was not, maybe, I don't know if blessing in disguise is the right word, but just to sharpen him, refocus him. I don't know. Do you see that it would have brought us to the same point anyway, or those two different scenarios? What do you make of that? Yeah,
I do. I mostly agree with you there. Like I said, I think his summer was kind of like a purgatory, where it was kind of a cleansing period. We don't need to get into the theology of purgatory here, but I think the result genuinely humbled him a little bit. Like, he's held that seat for 20 something years, the previous seat, Carleton. And it was, I will say, I went in the final weekend of the campaign. I was working in the Conservative War Room. And in the final weekend of the campaign, we were done. I was done the stuff I was working on. So I went to his riding to help out. Not because I was actually, not because I was sent there, just because honestly, I wanted to go to Manotick, which is a nice part of Ottawa. And I remember knocking on a door. I was doing kind of GOTV, like just making sure, hey, sir, have you voted? Just making sure you voted, kind of stuff. And knocking on, I'll try and keep it vague, but the door I knocked on, it was the perfect embodiment of kind of some of the demographic shifts. That his riding was a perfect storm for kind of demographic changes, where we won younger voters, working class voters, and we lost kind of older, wealthier, whiter boomers, basically. And his riding was the perfect microcosm for some of these shifts. Because it's a rural Ottawa riding, but it's full of kind of like retired civil servants, lots of like wealthy people, retired people, semi-retired people. And I remember knocking on someone's door, and it was someone who had voted for Pierre, every other time until this time. And it was the classic like boomer. I don't think they had like an elbows up sign in their front lawn, but it was that kind of person. And he said, well, I've actually voted for the other guy. And I was just perplexed. So I was like, okay, I'm going to ask him why. So I asked him why, and he said, he said to me, he's like, well, Pierre normally knocks on my door every single campaign, and he hasn't knocked on my door once in this campaign. And I said to him, like, you do understand that he's the national leader of the party.
Right.
So he doesn't have time to knock on every door. He's like, nope, doesn't matter. And
Wow.
so there was stuff like that where that riding I actually don't think was as safe as people think it was. It was safe because Pierre worked so damn hard keeping it safe. And the only reason we held that riding in 2015 when Trudeau won was because Pierre worked harder than anyone else to keep it. So I know I'm rambling here, but he's been in a kind of purgatorial phase where he's been humbled. He's had to think about things. And I think he has been doing that to a certain extent, from what I can tell from conversations I've had. So I think the Pierre you're going to see in the House going forward now, he's not going to be entirely different. Someone doesn't change who they are overnight or in a few months. And he has been who he is for decades now. But I do think you'll see a kind of subtle evolution in him. And I think you're already seeing signs of that. He's being more conciliatory. He's showing a willingness to work with the Liberals in a way that you wouldn't have seen this time last year. So, look, I don't think people should expect a kind of completely reinvented Pierre, and I don't think that'd be a good idea either, because that would be very inauthentic. But I do think you'll see a subtle kind of you're seeing subtle shifts and a kind of evolution in Pierre.
I do wonder too, and I mean, you think of how kind of things have shifted a bit since the election, that it was kind of a perfect storm, almost a once in a lifetime kind of an election. Like, I don't know when the next election is going to be or what might happen between now and then, but it's not going to be the same. And those factors that were there, especially the 51st state stuff, even the Trump factor, that's changed in just a few months, right? So we are starting to see maybe a move away from, the factors that really shaped that election.
Yeah, you're seeing it in polling, right? When at the cabinet retreat that the Liberals had, I think it was last week, I think it was Leger that presented polling that showed that Trump is kind of fading. It's not that the issue has gone away, but it's fading into kind of just one of the many issues and domestic issues. So as much as maybe some of the potency of this is an issue and the kind of 51st state stuff is going to fade, and Trump does seem to stop that. USMCA negotiations, I do expect, will be kind of front page of the news for the next little while. So that will keep these issues still off, maybe not top of mind, but will still be a major issue for voters. Yeah. But yeah, I do think you're seeing a shift back, and it makes sense that the reason why we were doing so well a year ago and why we were driving the news and we were driving the narrative and driving the agenda was because we were tapping into issues, whether it was housing costs, whether it was cost of living, whether it was crime. These are real issues that real people are facing, and that people that in real Canada, I'll call it, normal Canada, are dealing with. Nothing has changed in the last 6 months for those issues to go away. Things are shifting. So like housing, I think, is a very interesting issue where we've got kind of, I've said Pierre's been using this, the next or the new housing crisis. In Toronto, we've simultaneously got house prices remaining unaffordable for most people. And yet we've also got a housing crash for condos that no one wants to buy, these kind of box condos that were just built as investment vehicles that no one wants to buy, but because they're so disconnected from the rest of the market.
It's a skill that can be learned.
So,
it can be practiced.
These issues are still there. Crime is another one where crime is top of mind for voters. But I don't think that's going anywhere. And I think Carney will struggle to fix that, even if the Attorney General has promised bail reform. And then the other thing I think you're seeing from Pierre is a willingness, which I think is good. And I quite frankly wish we'd done this sooner when I was still working for him. But a willingness to talk about immigration, which is it's an issue that is top of mind for lots of voters in a way that it was not, even 2 years ago, but certainly not 10 years ago. And so I think between crime, cost of living, and immigration, you've got a good new core of issues there that Pierre is on comfortable ground on, where he can try and start driving the agenda again and making Carney, one, making him uncomfortable, but two, kind of sooner or later we're going to get into kind of put up or shut up territory where they keep saying the right things and all sorts of things, but they've actually got to start delivering at some point, right? And I think people are willing to give Carney a little bit of leeway, but I do think that they're running out of runway on that.
Right. And it is. And I think that's one big distinction now. You think back last year, right? I mean, Justin Trudeau was, these were his failures. I think Canadians were tiring of him. There was a much clearer distinction, I think, between, Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre. So some of those factors have changed. Mark Carney is a different kind of leader. As you say, he's got this bit of a honeymoon that it's seen as his predecessor's failures, not necessarily his, and maybe he's more prepared to move a little bit more to the center right. So what kind of challenges then does that pose for Pierre Poilievre?
I've said this a few times now, but I think it's both a challenge and an opportunity for conservatives more broadly, in that, Carney is quote unquote stealing liberal conservative ideas, which, that's annoying because it's a problem because, how do you distinguish? And the advantage of being in government is that if you have an idea, you can implement it. So if you steal it from someone else and you do it, then you'll get the credit for it. I recall, I won't repeat the words that we used, but I recall, I think it was right before the campaign. It was basically just after Carney had axed the carbon tax. And I think it was Abacus polling where it was, who do you credit for getting rid of the carbon tax? And it was like 46% Carney, 24% Poilievre. And it's just, I have lots I could say about that. It just tells you something about how democracy works. But, Poilievre won that issue and Pierre won that issue and he drove that, right? The reason the carbon tax has gone today is because of Pierre. But Carney gets the credit for it. So the challenge there is they steal your ideas, they get the credit for them. And the Liberals are this, in some ways remarkable chameleon party where they can shift to the left and they can steal NDP ideas and they get the credit for them. And then they can shift to the right and steal conservative ideas and get credit for them. So that's a challenge and there's no getting around that. And so, challenge for Pierre and the Conservatives is going to be finding ways to distinguish themselves. But I also think it's an event. It's an opportunity in that if the Liberals shift to the right, which they clearly have to a certain extent, and I do think some of these changes that are coming, where they're trying to clearly move around change caucus members a little bit, where people are leaving and coming in. I do think Carney's going to start kind of putting his real stamp on that caucus more so. It's very much still the Trudeau caucus. And I think as some of these people leave, people like Freeland, it will become much more the kind of the Carney caucus. And I expect that caucus will look a bit different in that it will be a much more kind of, there's a very famous book about kind of it's called The Ottawa Men. It's basically about it's about kind of the rise of the kind of civil service, the kind of Laurentian civil service after the Second World War. Grandstein is the Jack Grandstein, I think the name of the author was. And these Ottawa Men, I suspect, are very much the kinds of people that Carney will want to bring into the caucus. I'm thinking people like kind of Tim Hodgson, who's done, I think he's done a pretty good job so far. At least he seems to be doing a good job. And then other kind of, some of these like staffing hires he's made, like Michael Sabia, his chief of staff. So Carney is going to, I think, try and keep governing to the right, especially when, there's no organized opposition on the left. But the opportunity for Pierre here is that it's not a bad thing to have your opponent arguing on your turf, right? If the kind of Overton window shifts to the right, that means that conservative ideas just instinctively and naturally become more credible and more serious. And it makes it, paradoxically, yes, it means that Liberals can steal conservative ideas, but it also makes it much harder for Liberals to attack conservative ideas, right? So the challenge is going to be still finding ways to distinguish. Pierre's going to have to find ways to distinguish himself from the Prime Minister. But I do think there's plenty of issues where he will be able to say things and do things that and advocate for things that that the Liberals will not want to do. I think things like crime and immigration are good examples of that. But arguing on kind of conservative terrain in the long term is good for conservatives, I think.
Do you think it puts Pierre Poilievre in a spot, though, where he may have to be the one, or the Conservatives will have to be the ones to prop up this government? I mean, Mark Carney is still in a minority government, as irrelevant as the NDP have kind of become. I mean, he may still have to lean on them or the Bloc from time to time, but it could potentially put the Conservatives in an interesting position on some issues if the NDP and the Bloc are opposed. Would Pierre Poilievre play that role?
This is a very interesting question right now, and I don't know this, but if I had to guess, I'm sure part of the reason why they're delaying the budget when they initially said, early October and it's now early November, I'm sure Liberals behind closed doors are asking these questions too. And I think we got used federally to having we've had a minority parliament now since 2019. Right. We've only had one majority government in the last majority government would have been Trudeau's first government, but I think because of the supply and confidence agreement, we got used to thinking of minorities as very stable, and they're not. Right? Minorities don't generally last more than 18 months, and I'm not making a prediction there on how long this parliament will last, but minorities, just by the nature of them, tend to be unstable. And with all these with all these by-elections are potentially coming up. There's Freeland, there's other names that are being speculated. They're pretty close to majority right now, the Liberals, but every vote counts. And even if these seats sit empty for 3 months, that's one less vote in the House, 2 less votes in the House that they have. I also think political parties are generally ruthlessly cynical in terms of kind of decisions they make, and so I know the NDP will have trouble, I'm sure, supporting a kind of centre-right budget, but I'm sure the NDP also absolutely knows that they can't go to an election right now, and the idea that they would bring the government down when they don't have a leader, they're worse than bankrupt in some ways. Like I'd be shocked if the NDP were like itching for an election right now. Maybe I'm sure what the Liberals will want to do is kind of make the Conservatives a natural dance partner on this, but I think that's easier said than done. And even if they include lots of goodies in that budget that Conservatives have advocated for or want, the deficit is probably going to be kind of astronomically large with all these commitments. And I don't see a world where Conservatives are going to support a deficit that's larger than anything Trudeau's government's put forward. So yeah, I think the Liberals are in a very interesting spot right now. I mean, the one party that is cynically transactional in the federal parliament is the Bloc. So I'm sure there's goodies that the Liberals could promise the Bloc to get them to at least to support the budget for at least one cycle. But it'd be an interesting thing to watch, because right now it does seem like the Liberals are in a bit of a pickle here, and I don't think there's any there's in theory every party is a natural dance partner, but also every party has in theory got good reasons to not support the budget and to not vote for the Liberal.
Yeah, and I mean, look, a slowing economy is eventually going to drag down any political party and political leader, even one that's in a bit of a honeymoon phase. So I think that's going to play out in the months ahead. In the meantime, it is telling, I think, as you pointed out, where the Conservatives see vulnerabilities here. And I think it speaks to dysfunction in the immigration system, dysfunction in the criminal justice system. So maybe no surprise the Conservatives have keyed in there. But it is interesting, too, and it sort of speaks to this evolving dynamic where the Conservatives are maybe trying to appeal more to blue-collar workers and the focus on the temporary foreign workers program, right? A policy position that BC's NDP premier supports, labor groups support, whereas businesses are a little more uneasy. What does that tell us about the state of conservatism, or where the Conservative Party is focused right now?
Look, I think it's a no-brainer to kind of go after this program, and the conservative immigration critic Michelle Rempel-Garner has been doing an outstanding job on this file so far, and kudos to her. And she's been go to her Twitter X, whatever it's called now, X page, and she's been doing a kind of series highlighting what is clearly kind of like blatant abuse of this program, and the points that the Conservatives are making and hammering, and I think there's a variety of reasons to do this, but number one reason is that they're right, and it's the right argument to make, is that we've got youth unemployment levels at kind of not record, like near record numbers we haven't seen in decades, and you've got I won't name specific companies, but you've got companies just bringing in cheap foreign labor that that people can say, well, they're paying them a certain amount, but what it really does is people that are here as temporary foreign workers are not, they're not free to just kind of move between jobs, right? In many ways, they're kind of trapped in those jobs if they want to stay here. And the program is exploitative, it's abusive, and not every employer abuses it, but some do. There's clearly rampant abuse in the program. So look, I think number one, it's a clear issue that needs to get fixed. For just kind of faith and credibility of the immigration system itself. And that is starting to waver. Polling is showing that. And I'm sure anecdotally, in my social circles, I've seen it. I don't know if people can tell, I'm a first generation immigrant. Like, I am not someone that is, wants to not see immigration in this country. I think it's an important thing. And one of Canada's kind of greatest success stories is our ability to, until quite recently, I think, was our ability to integrate immigrants. And the faith in that system is fading quite quickly, and abuse in things like the TFW program are rapidly contributing to that. So there's that, but I also think there's a very obvious play here with younger voters. We did well with younger voters. We did but I think we can do better. And youth unemployment levels are astronomical. I think don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure male youth unemployment is also it's staggeringly high. I don't know if this was Ontario nationally, but I think 25% of I don't want to use the number because I can't remember it exactly, but
it's up around 20%.
Yeah, which is unbelievable. Yeah. And you have to put yourselves in the mind of a 20-year-old young person here. You're already kind of probably quite cynical about the housing market. You feel like it doesn't matter if you work hard, you get an education, you get a job. House prices are just so divorced from all of that now that, you don't know if you're ever going to be able to buy a house. And then on top of that, you can't even forget getting on the housing ladder. You can't even get on the job ladder the job market, because you can't even get, these basic jobs, these entry-level jobs at Tim Hortons or something like that, where you start building skills and start building a resume. That is quite, I suspect that is, in fact, I know that is very radicalizing for young people. And so it's a problem we need to address for a variety of reasons. But it's also good politics, right? We did well with conservative young men at the last election, but we can definitely still do better. Issues like this I think it's showing that Pierre has still got his finger on the pulse. Mm-hmm. Something that Pierre is brilliant at, and I still think he's got this going for him, is that Pierre is very good at identifying issues before they become issues, and when the pundit class will, dismiss them. I think inflation was probably the best example of this. Yeah. Pierre's talking about inflation. When you said you had experts saying it was all transitory and it wasn't nothing to worry about. Pierre looked prescient on that, right? Because he was prescient. He was ahead of the curve. And I think on immigration, he's correctly identifying an issue where, even if the pundit class says that, oh, this isn't an issue, or see Carney's addressing it, I think he's making a calculated gamble that they're not going to fix this and that this is going to continue to become an issue. So I think it's good coalitional politics, but also just think it's good policy, quite frankly. And this is it's a program ripe with abuse that needs to get fixed.
Mm-hmm. Let me just ask you too about the premier's factor in all of this, without rehashing the election. And I think to a large extent, Doug Ford and Danielle Smith were kind of headaches in their own way, maybe for the Conservative campaign. And I think they both see themselves as national figures to some degree. They've got their own sort of agendas, I suppose, that they're pursuing. But you see an opportunity there for there to be more of kind of this conservative united front or coalition, or is that still a problem for Pierre Poilievre?
I think there are going to be opportunities to work with premiers on issues, and that they should do that. I don't think provincial politicians and federal politicians not always getting along, even if they're at the same political stripe, is actually particularly new. I think one of the good things about our political system in Canada is that, that just because you're a conservative in Ontario doesn't mean it's not the exact same thing as a conservative federally, and same in Alberta, same in BC, same in Newfoundland. I think that's actually a good thing for our system because it creates checks and balances, right? It's a kind of a natural kind of way of dispersing and checking power, a very Canadian way of doing it. But I do think something that Conservatives need to do is stop picking so many fights, probably is the best way to put it, whether it's with media, whether it was with premiers, whether it's with Bay Street. It doesn't mean they shouldn't pick fights, but I don't think you need to make everyone your enemy, and finding allies is important. So I do think part of what this new Conservative kind of this next phase of this opposition needs to do is find ways to not necessarily, you don't have to get along and agree with everyone and everything, but kind of find ways to make common cause with people when it makes sense, and think about it in those terms, not pick fights that don't necessarily help you, whether that's with media or whether that's with stakeholders or premiers. But I don't think I wouldn't expect to see some sort of kind of grand. I think we're in a moment right now that immensely. This time last year, so this is mid-September. This time last year, I think we were very much in a mood of kind of incumbency fatigue, and being an incumbent in government was bad. It didn't help you in public opinion, public perception. I think what happened with Trump and the kind of the new moment that we're in now is all of a sudden we went from being incumbency being a disadvantage to being an advantage. Because it's much easier to look kind of like a statesman and like a prime minister if you are the prime minister or if you are a premier, right? And so I think all the kind of incentives now are for kind of incumbents to kind of help each other, broadly speaking, and especially because we're not, an election, probably not on the cusp of an election anytime soon. I'll eat my words if the budget accidentally doesn't pass and we do have a winter election. But I think there's a natural tendency for incumbents right now to work together, which is going to be a challenge for oppositional figures. Again, not just Conservatives federally. I think this is true of opposition parties provincially as well that struggle to break through because of this. And one thing I think it's a noticeable difference between opposition in say many provinces, but federally is the Conservatives are still very good at kind of making news and breaking through in news. I think provincial opposition parties, whether it's in Ontario, whether it's in Alberta, whether it's in all sorts of different places, struggle to do that. And I think that's actually a testament to how good at driving a message Pierre and the Conservatives still are. But I think this is going to be a minefield to navigate here, simultaneously kind of maintaining independence and brand independence and autonomy, whilst also showing that you can work with other people, but also showing that you're still willing to fight, right? And I think I've written this elsewhere, but I think part of what Pierre, let's call it Pierre 2.0, this kind of evolved Pierre needs to do is, I don't think he needs to abandon his kind of fighting spirit. He's a fighter. He's fighting for certain people. And I think that is a genuine strength of his. It's who he is. And it's also an asset. What I think he needs to do is kind of become almost like a happy warrior, where he does that with a kind of authentic and genuine kind of smile on his face. It doesn't come across maybe as so aggressive. And I think he's been doing a good job of that for the most part. But I still think what he needs to do is, if he wants to fight for, he's fundamentally, I think the next election will still end up making the case for why he is change and why we need change. And so he still needs to show why he's going to be different and why he's going to make change. And part of that is going to be a willingness to take on powerful stakeholders and powerful interests that stand in the way of change. So he needs to, I think they need to kind of build some bridges, but I also don't think they want to become completely mushy on that and abandon any kind of ability to oppose powerful players and stakeholders just because they're incumbents or that they're powerful.
Yeah. Well, very interesting fall shaping up here. We'll leave it there for now. Ben, much more from you. We'll watch for at mbpolicy.com. In the meantime, appreciate your insight on all of this, and thanks so much for joining us here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so there you go. Once again, some unique perspective from someone who's worked on the inside, worked with Pierre Poilievre, Ben Woodfinden, former Director of Communications for the Conservative leader, now a senior advisor at Meredith Boessenkool Philips and Director of MPB Intelligence. More at mbpolicy.com. Coming up in just a moment, a conversation about the CBC and the future of Canada's public broadcaster. David Cayley is the author of a new book. It's called The CBC, How Canada's Public Broadcaster Lost Its Voice and How to Get It Back. We'll have that conversation next on The Rob Breakenridge Show. There's certainly been a lot of conversation as of late about CBC's future. Does it have a future? What kind of future for the public broadcaster? Well, to that end, there's a timely and important new book out. It's called The CBC, How Canada's Public Broadcaster Lost Its Voice and How to Get It Back. Joining us on the line is the author of that book and several others as well, writer, retired broadcaster, David Cayley, joining us on the podcast here. David, great to have you with us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So as mentioned, you spent many years at the CBC. You've got a connection to the CBC and interest in what happens to the CBC. So let's talk, first of all, kind of about what motivated you to write this book and just what you're seeing in terms of the conversation that's happening around this issue.
Well, the book has a long story. As you can imagine, I began freelancing at CBC Radio in 1971. And by the end of that decade was interested in CBC history, was lucky to be able in the mid-'80s on the 50th anniversary of the creation of the CBC to do a series of 5 documentaries, which allowed me to meet some of the founders, Graham Spry, Alphonse Ouimet, other resident names for those who know the history of the CBC. So it's a long, I would say, this book has been gestating for maybe 50 years.
Wow. Do you feel like the CBC is at a bit of a crossroads here too, though?
Well, I do. I would say it perhaps with some sense of irony, because the CBC has been at a crossroads ever since it was invented. And I could give you a whole book full of headlines about the CBC in crisis, the CBC searching for its identity, the CBC had lost its way. I could show you an article by Graham Spry, who led the Radio League, which first lobbied for public broadcasting, speaking about public broadcasting being in terminal decline, writing in the late 1950s. So one would like to be cautious about crossroads, right. But that said, yes, I think it is.
And whether it's something we need to preserve, even if it looks different, because, as you point out in the book, part of the conversation that's happening right now is, do we need the CBC? Or, conservatives have talked about defunding the CBC. And I think what you're presenting in this book is not, let's scrap the CBC, but rather let's reform the CBC.
Yes. Well, I mean, the CBC, when it began in 1936, after a 4-year earlier experiment with something called the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Commission, it was in charge of the entire broadcasting system. People hardly remember that now. That lasted till 1958. But the idea was that the air, we still felt the air was a commons, and that there should be a public agency in charge, coordinating the entire broadcasting system. Well, that's long gone. And the Conservative Party has always argued that if private provision is available, why do you need a public broadcaster? It's just there because of a so-called market failure, right? Mm-hmm. As soon as private provision becomes available, you don't need the public anymore. My argument today would not be that we should go back to 1936, but that the breakdown, let's say, in our national conversation, the ways in which people are at each other, and the fact that their positions very often rest on incompatible assumptions. We don't have a national consensus. We have, pardon me, we have something more like a national dissensus, if I can use that word. And I think the recreation of a public sphere, of a place of conversation, is a fit purpose for the CBC, and one not likely to be occupied by others, so that it really does fit with its statutory mandate. And I do not think private provision is going to be available.
Right. And so it sort of speaks to you, and you talk about these different eras of the CBC that we've seen since its inception. And, well, obviously we're in a different world almost 100 years later, that there are some things that CBC can learn from its past, or the institution that it was in that so-called first era.
Well, I think so. I mean, the CBC that I have worked in, and that has existed beginning in the 1960s and developing through that period, I call a populist organization. Now, the word is questionable because it isn't what populism currently means politically. It was the word that we use at the CBC, right? That the first era from the 30s into the 60s was generally seen as more elitist, right? A word that was often used at the CBC to really describe some sense of mission or vision that was apart from whether something was popular, whether it was wanted. The CBC felt it had a vocation. The move from the 60s on was generally to identify with the audience, right? If you turn on the CBC today, CBC radio, you'll constantly hear we and you, as if you're known. You're being addressed as if you're known, and you are being addressed as one of us. So it speaks as if there were one people. But my argument is that has broken down. There is not one people. There are multiple divergent publics, and the CBC increasingly only speaks to one of them. And that, I think, has to change. So how you're recovering, to try and answer your question, the spirit of the first era, that requires a lot of thinking and a lot of discussion. I'm not advocating elitism But neither were the people of the first era advocating elitism. That isn't how they saw themselves. They may have seen themselves as educators to a certain extent. But I do think if one reviews the history, it's interesting to think what can be recuperated from an earlier time.
Right. And part of it, and you touched on it, was the idea of the public or the audience. And does the audience matter? Are you serving the audience, reflecting the audience, or trying to shape the audience? Or does audience even matter at all? And that's been a part of the conversation, it seems, through these eras for the CBC.
Well, I think the difficulty with the audience or with the public is that it's singular, right? Whereas there are, in fact, many publics and many audiences. So in the book, I took up the example of the Freedom Convoy, which to me has all the earmarks of an emergent public. It bubbled up spontaneously, although now the supposed leaders are being prosecuted. There weren't really leaders in the beginning. They were more or less delegated as the thing went on. So it gathered steam as it grew. People came out onto the bridges, into the parking lots. It was spontaneous, largely leaderless, and quite inchoate. It had an idea, right? It had the imposition of a vaccine mandate on the truckers was certainly the starting point. There was an issue, but it was to a degree formless. It needed to be in conversation. It needed to be interrogated. But instead, when they reached Ottawa, and I know they were noisy and rambunctious, although largely friendly, I think, they were treated as enemies, not as an emergent public. And that's how the CBC treated the whole manifestation, not as something to engage in conversation, but as a security problem, a public order problem, a misinformation problem. There were many diagnoses, but no conversation. Mm-hmm. And to me, that drives people into more extreme positions, right? It creates an enemy structure. So yes, I'm talking about a different attitude towards the public as a dynamic and changing field rather than that there is the public or the audience.
It's interesting because it sort of speaks to what the CBC is, and I guess different concepts of what we mean by public broadcaster, because I think what you're talking about is CBC journalism, news coverage, or conversations happening on CBC radio. The other big part of CBC is the idea that it creates content, dramas, sitcoms that are meant to reflect, Canadian identity or, as you say, the quote unquote public. So are these sort of distinguishable universes within CBC, or does all of this eventually overlap?
I think it all overlaps. I mean, I've written about what for me is the formulaic quality of certain CBC dramas, which I don't mean they're in any way incompetent or badly done, but I think there was more heart in the entertainment on CBC television and radio, also through radio drama, formerly. So I wouldn't say no, make the CBC just a news or a current affairs organization. I think it's an attitude I'm talking about, and I think it could inform all aspects of public broadcasting.
Mm-hmm. And is this something that, was this a slow process that you observed during your time there? Did you see these changes happening, or this change in direction happening in real time?
Yes, I did. If you take the image of an era, which I borrowed from an old friend and a broadcaster of the first era of the CBC called Eric Koch, who did a history of a controversial television program called This Hour Has 7 Days. And I make quite a lot of that in my book because I do see it as the beginning, the kind of the revolutionary moment, if you like. And Eric says in his book about those events in the 60s that was the end of an era. And I took that on board and tried to develop the idea of a second era, which I now see as ending, and then the possibility of a third era. If you look at it that way, you're not saying that there's something bad about it, right? There are amazing accomplishments are part of the second era, right? So let's say Peter Zosky, a beloved broadcaster, This Country in the Morning, Morningside. These were remarkable achievements and beloved in the country, but the style that they embodied, you can be seen in retrospect to be moving in a certain direction, to have a terminus. Ideas run out, times change. So yes, it happened over a very long period of time. But and the last, let's say 30 years since a process that I describe in some detail called creative renewal was begun around 1990 at the CBC. Short answer, yes. Mm-hmm. Long process with many phases.
There's the uncomfortable relationship between the CBC and government. I mean, government shapes the CBC mandate, government funds the CBC, but there is, I guess, that degree of independence. But when we talk about the need for change or reform, does it inevitably involve a government role here, do you think?
Well, that's really a question I can barely answer. Mm. Well, one point I did make is that the CBC fought through the 40s and into the 50s for its political independence.
Right.
And the government at first was quite free with calling up and saying, cancel that program. We don't want that. So there was prolonged, overt interference, and the CBC fought hard to win an arm's length relationship. That was one of the reasons why they were nervous in the 60s, why management were nervous when programs like This Hour Has 7 Days thought they could become political crusaders, thought they could promise people justice, because then the political neutrality is violated.
Right. Well,
how the political neutrality is to be regained and how that's going to go down with the government, I think that's a big question and one that has to be investigated. I think right now the CBC is tending to retrench on older positions. It wants to go, like everybody in the world, make America great again. Right? Let's go back. Let's retrench on things that have worked. And I'm saying, no, it's time to look forward, but it's not as if one has a blueprint.
Mm-hmm. And the other point, you do address it in the book, and I mean, we are in this new era, this digital world where, the whole concept of what a broadcaster is kind of changed. But despite that, you still see that a public broadcaster with the right sort of role and mandate can still be relevant, can still matter in this environment.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think this environment is quite beyond our comprehension, right? Mm-hmm. If you know even a little history of media effects, right? Let's say the printing press in the Europe of the early 1500s. I mean, it was a revolutionary impact. Now, look at our time. Just in our lifetimes, I mean, every single person with a smartphone is a broadcaster.
Right.
It's pretty breathtaking. It's pretty incomprehensible, and I don't think we know how we're ever going to regain our balance with media at the intensity we now have media. But I do think there is a role, let's say an exemplar. Could you say exemplary, perhaps, right? As a model of discourse, of inclusivity, of listening. You know, it isn't ever going to be the same as when there was one CBC station in your town.
Right.
You know, it is an incomprehensibly complex environment. But yes, my intuition is that there is a role.
I guess on the flip side, though, David, what's your concern moving forward if nothing changes, if it's, the status quo prevails?
Well, I don't know. I mean, if the Conservative Party were probably were done out of an election victory earlier this year by circumstances, by the man who might have been thought their ally, Donald Trump. I mean, it every likelihood a few months earlier would have been that they would have been elected and then would have gone about defunding the CBC,
right?
Whatever that might have meant, right? And conservative governments have come to power before, hostile to the CBC, but generally have thought it's not. When in office, have thought it's not really worth the trouble. But I don't think there was ever as big a mobilization as with the Poilievre Conservatives. And, it was a big applause line at the rallies, right? Defund the CBC. Yes, yes, yes. So what would have happened? I don't know. Now we've got a government who thinks the CBC is useful, but they haven't really in any way committed themselves to thinking about the CBC.
No.
So I don't know. I wouldn't venture a prediction at this point. No. But my interest in doing this book was really in putting some ideas into play about it, to start conversations, to start people thinking, even within the CBC and without. But without a definite plan of any kind.
Well, I think it is a conversation worth having for Canadians for sure. The book is called The CBC, How Canada's Public Broadcaster Lost Its Voice and How to Get It Back. David Cayley, thank you so much for joining us here. Appreciate this conversation.
Thank you, Rob. Glad to be here.
All right, once again, that was David Cayley. His new book is called The CBC, How Canada's Public Broadcaster Lost Its Voice and How to Get It Back. Our thanks also to Ben Woodfinden, former Director of Communications for Pierre Poilievre, now with Meredith Boessenkool Philips. Some interesting insights on everything happening in Ottawa these days. That's where we will leave it for this episode of The Rob Breakenridge Show. You can find us at our Substack page. Subscribe to us there, robbreakenridge.ca. We'll have a new episode of The Rob Breakenridge Show for you coming up on Tuesday. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend, folks, and we'll talk to you next week. Take care.